The champagne glass trembled in Emily Carter's hand as Jason Reed smirked into the microphone, his voice slicing through the ballroom. Let's be honest, she'll never be loved again. A ripple of laughter spread, sharp and cruel, but Emily didn't move, didn't break, her silence louder than his words as the grand doors suddenly opened and every head turned. A man stepped in, tailored suit, quiet power, the investor everyone was waiting for, Alexander Hayes. And he walked straight past Jason, straight to her, dropped to one knee, a diamond catching the light. Then let me prove him wrong. And the room stopped breathing. Some women are simply impossible to love once you see who they really are. Jason Reed's voice carried effortlessly across the ballroom, smooth and deliberate, wrapped in a smile that almost passed for charm if you didn't know him. If you hadn't once stood where Emily Carter stood now, frozen beneath the weight of 100 watching eyes and the low hum of whispered judgment that followed his words like a shadow, the chandeliers above spilled gold across marble floors, champagne glasses clinked softly in manicured hands, and yet everything felt distant, muted, as if the world had stepped back just far enough to watch her break, to see if she would lower her gaze, if she would shrink the way she used to when his words found their mark with surgical precision. She didn't move. Not immediately, her fingers tightening slightly around the stem of her glass, the cool surface grounding her as the echo of his voice settled into the room, into her chest, into the quiet place where his voice had once lived rent-free, repeating the same verdict over and over again, until she almost believed it. Around her, the city's elite shifted subtly, some pretending not to listen, others leaning in just enough to catch every word, their expressions carefully neutral, but their curiosity unmistakable, because humiliation, when dressed in designer suits and soft lighting, had always been the most captivating performance of all. Jason took a slow sip of his drink, savoring the moment, his confidence effortless, practiced, as if this were just another speech, another victory, another reminder that he still held the narrative, that he could still define her in a single sentence and walk away untouched. Emily lifted her chin, just slightly. Not enough to challenge him, not enough to invite confrontation, but enough to breathe, enough to remind herself that she was still here, still standing, still intact in ways he would never understand, her reflection catching briefly in the mirrored wall across the room. A woman in a simple black dress that didn't scream for attention but didn't apologize either, a woman who no longer needed to be seen through his eyes to exist. Somewhere behind her, a server passed, the faint scent of citrus and polished silver trailing in the air, and for a fleeting second it felt like any other evening, any other gathering, until the silence stretched just a fraction too long, until the weight of what had been said began to settle into something heavier, something irreversible. She could feel the past pressing in, the late nights where his voice had sounded softer but carried the same message, the careful erosion of confidence disguised as concern. The quiet insistence that she was lucky to have him, that without him she would fade into nothing, and for a long time, she had believed it, had shaped herself around that idea until there was barely anything left that felt like her. But tonight, something was different, not louder, not dramatic, just still, like the moment before a storm shifts direction, like the breath you take before realizing you don't need permission to exist anymore. Jason set his glass down, satisfied. The room still orbiting him, still centered on his version of truth, and Emily finally exhaled. Slow and steady, her grip loosening just enough to let the tension slip from her fingers, her silence no longer fragile but deliberate, controlled, and somewhere beyond the tall double doors at the far end of the ballroom, just out of sight, something was about to change, though he had no idea, not yet, and for the first time in a very long time, neither did she. The laughter did not last long, not because anyone defended her, but because something in the air shifted, subtle at first, like a draft slipping through a sealed room, and Emily felt it before she saw it. A quiet disturbance at the far end of the ballroom, where the tall double doors stood closed beneath the soft glow of wall sconces. She did not turn immediately, she did not give the moment away, but her senses sharpened, the low hum of conversation bending slightly, attention drifting like a tide being pulled by an unseen force. And for the first time since Jason spoke, the room was no longer entirely his. He did not notice at first, still caught in the comfort of his own performance, exchanging a few amused glances with those closest to him. His posture relaxed, his confidence unshaken, because why would it be? He had done this before, rewritten narratives, reshaped perceptions, walked away while others carried the weight of his words, and in his mind, this was no different, just another clean ending to a story he had already decided was over. Emily lowered her glass onto a passing tray without looking, her fingers finally free, the faint tremor gone, replaced by something steadier, something quieter, and as she breathed in, she caught a new scent threading through the room, not citrus, not champagne, something deeper, like polished wood and cold air after rain, and it did not belong to this carefully curated evening. A murmur began near the entrance, small, almost polite, but it spread quickly, not loud enough to interrupt yet strong enough to redirect, heads turning one by one, conversations pausing mid-sentence, and then the doors opened. It was not dramatic, not loud, just a smooth, deliberate movement, but it carried weight, the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself because it was already expected, already known, and the man who stepped inside did not hesitate, did not scan the room for approval. He walked forward with the kind of certainty that made space without asking for it. A few people straightened instinctively. Others exchanged quick looks, recognition flashing across their faces, and somewhere behind Jason, someone whispered a name under their breath, too low to catch but heavy enough to matter. Jason's smile faltered, just slightly, the first crack, his attention pulling away from the circle he had built around himself as he followed the shift in the room. His gaze landing on the man now moving across the marble floor with measured steps, each one unhurried, controlled, and entirely indifferent to the spectacle that had just unfolded. Emily still had not turned fully, but now she did, slowly, as if the moment belonged to her, and she would meet it on her own terms, her eyes lifting, finding him without searching, and something unspoken passed between them, not familiarity. Exactly, not yet. But recognition, like 2 points finally aligning after a long, invisible trajectory. The music had not stopped, but it felt distant now, like a memory of sound rather than something present, and the room that had once felt suffocating seemed to widen, the weight of judgment thinning, replaced by something sharper, more focused, as attention shifted completely, decisively. Jason set his glass down a little too quickly this time, the faint clink against the tray louder than it should have been, his mind catching up, recalculating, because this was not part of the script, this was not something he had accounted for, and for the first time that evening, he was no longer the one controlling the room. The man did not look at him, not even once, not yet, his focus fixed, unwavering, and as he closed the distance, the silence that followed him was not empty, it was charged, deliberate, the kind of silence that did not wait for permission to become something more, and Emily felt it settle around her, not heavy, not overwhelming, but certain, as if the night itself had shifted direction and there was no going back. He stopped just a step away from her, close enough that the space between them no longer belonged to the room, and for a brief second, everything held its breath, the chandeliers, the music, even the quiet judgment that had once filled the air, seemed to suspend itself in anticipation. Emily felt it, the stillness, the shift, the undeniable sense that whatever came next would not ask for permission, and she lifted her gaze fully now, meeting his eyes without hesitation, without doubt, as if something in her had already decided to stand. He studied her for a moment, not with curiosity, not with surprise, but with a calm recognition that felt almost grounding, as though he saw not the version of her that had just been reduced to a sentence, but something far more complete, something intact. And then, only then, he spoke, his voice low but clear enough to cut through the silence. "You let him finish," he said, not as a question, but as a quiet observation, and there was no judgment in it, only a steady kind of understanding that did not demand explanation. Emily did not answer right away, her breath steady, her shoulders relaxed in a way they had not been minutes ago, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft but unwavering. "He always liked an audience," she said, and it was not bitterness that colored her words, but clarity, the kind that comes only after something has already broken and been rebuilt. Behind them, The room leaned in, drawn not by spectacle now, but by something quieter, something far more difficult to look away from, because power had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, and everyone could feel it. The man turned slightly then, just enough for his presence to register beyond her, his gaze sweeping once across the room before settling, briefly, on Jason, and in that single glance there was no challenge, no anger, only a measured acknowledgement that felt far more unsettling than any confrontation could have been, as if he were assessing something already decided. Jason straightened, instinctively, his posture tightening, the easy confidence from moments ago slipping into something more rigid, more controlled, his mind racing to place the man, to understand why the room had turned, why the balance had shifted so quickly and so completely. A voice from near the back, hushed but urgent, finally broke through the silence. That is Alexander Hayes. And the name moved through the crowd like a quiet current, recognition spreading, posture changing, conversations halting entirely now as reality caught up with the moment. Alexander did not react to the ripple, did not acknowledge the shift, his attention returning fully to Emily as if the rest of the room had already ceased to matter. And there was something deliberate in that choice, something that made everything else feel secondary, temporary, irrelevant. He took a small step closer, closing the final distance, and the movement was simple, almost understated, yet it carried more weight than anything that had been said all evening. Because it was not about display, it was about intention. Emily felt it. The certainty, the absence of hesitation, and for the first time that night, the past did not press in, it did not echo, it did not define the space she stood in, because whatever was unfolding now was entirely separate from it. Jason opened his mouth, as if to speak, to reclaim something, to interrupt the trajectory that had slipped beyond his control, but no sound came, the moment no longer his to shape, no longer his to command. Alexander's voice came again, quieter this time, meant only for her, but heard by everyone. You were never what he said, he murmured, and there was no need to raise it, no need to prove it, because the truth of it did not rely on volume, only on presence. And as Emily held his gaze, something settled into place, something final, something unshakable, and across the room, Jason realized too late that whatever he had tried to define was no longer his to name, not anymore. For a moment, no one moved, as if the entire room had forgotten how to exist without the script it had been following. And Emily felt the weight of that silence settle not on her shoulders, but around her, like something protective, something deliberate, and Alexander did not rush it, did not fill it with unnecessary words. He simply held his place in front of her, steady, certain, as though time itself had adjusted to his pace. Somewhere behind them, a glass was set down too quickly, the faint clink sharp against the quiet, and Jason finally found his voice, though it came thinner than before, edged with something unfamiliar. You are making a scene, he said, attempting control, attempting to reclaim a narrative that had already slipped from his hands. But the words did not land the way they once would have. They did not command attention. They only revealed the absence of it. Alexander did not turn immediately, and that pause, that choice not to acknowledge him right away, stretched longer than any confrontation could have, until finally he shifted his gaze just slightly, enough to meet Jason's eyes without fully giving him the center he so clearly wanted. And when he spoke, his tone remained calm, almost conversational. No, he said quietly. This was already a scene, and there was no accusation in it, only a simple correction that settled into the room with undeniable weight. A ripple moved through the crowd, subtle but real, as people recalibrated, as alliances of attention shifted, and Emily could feel it. The way the room no longer leaned toward Jason, no longer waited for his approval, but instead watched her, watched them, as if witnessing something far more meaningful than spectacle. Jason's jaw tightened, his composure thinning at the edges, his confidence now forced, constructed in real time as he searched for footing. You do not even know her, he said, the words sharper now, less controlled, and for the first time that evening, there was something defensive beneath them, something uncertain. Emily felt the echo of that sentence, the familiarity of it, how often it had been used to define her, to limit her, to reduce her into something smaller, something easier to dismiss. But this time it did not settle into her the same way. It did not take root, because the space inside her that once held those words had already been cleared, already been rebuilt. Alexander's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened, not in anger, but in clarity. "I know enough," he replied, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any argument, because it was not about proving anything. It was about recognizing what was already there. He turned fully back to Emily then, closing Jason out of the center entirely. And in that small, deliberate shift, the balance finalized, the room no longer divided, no longer uncertain, but aligned, and Emily felt it. The quiet certainty of standing in a moment that did not need to be defended, did not need to be explained. She took a slow breath, her fingers brushing lightly against the fabric of her dress, grounding herself in the present, in the reality that this was no longer the same story, no longer the same ending. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, carrying just far enough to be heard without demanding attention. "You always needed them to believe you," she said, her eyes meeting Jason's briefly, not with anger, not with hurt, but with a clarity that felt almost distant. "I never needed that." And the words did not strike, they did not wound. They simply existed, undeniable, final. The silence that followed was different now, not tense, not expectant, but resolved, as if something had quietly, irrevocably shifted into place, and across the room. Jason stood no longer at the center of anything, his presence reduced not by force, but by irrelevance, while in front of him, without raising her voice, without asking for validation, Emily had already stepped beyond the version of her he had tried to leave behind. The room did not erupt, it did not applaud, it simply shifted in a way that could not be undone, like a tide that had quietly turned while no one was watching. And Emily felt it in the way the air no longer pressed against her, but seemed to move with her instead, as if the space itself had finally made room. Alexander remained where he was, close but not overwhelming, his presence steady, grounded, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because nothing needed to be rushed, nothing needed to be proven. The truth of the moment already settling into every corner of the ballroom. Somewhere to the side, a woman adjusted her posture. A man cleared his throat, small human gestures attempting to re-anchor themselves in a reality that had just been rewritten. But no one dared interrupt. No one stepped forward to reclaim what had been lost, because even those who had once aligned themselves with Jason now felt the distance, the quiet but unmistakable separation between who held power and who had simply been loud. Jason tried once more to recover it, drawing in a breath, forcing a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Emily," he said, her name carrying a different weight now, less command, more uncertainty. "You do not have to do this." And the words hung there, oddly misplaced, as if he had mistaken the moment for something else, something he could still redirect. Emily looked at him then, fully, not as someone bracing for impact, not as someone waiting to be diminished, but as someone who had already stepped beyond his reach. And there was no anger in her gaze, no lingering attachment, only a quiet understanding that whatever existed between them had already ended long before this night. "I am not doing anything," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to be heard. "I am simply not stopping what is already happening." And the distinction settled into the space between them with quiet precision, leaving nothing for him to grasp. Alexander glanced at her briefly, a flicker of something like approval passing through his expression, not for what she said, but for how she stood, how she held the moment without needing to raise her voice or claim attention. And then he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, the movement smooth, unhurried, drawing the eyes of the entire room without a single word. Jason stilled, the last remnants of his composure tightening as realization began to form, slow but inevitable, while the crowd leaned in, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of certainty that something irreversible was about to unfold. Emily felt her breath catch, not in fear, not in doubt, but in the quiet recognition that this was the point where everything shifted from possibility into reality, where silence became action, and Alexander, without breaking the calm that had defined his presence from the moment he entered, stepped closer, closing the final space between them completely. his voice lowering just enough that it felt personal, even as the entire room listened. "You stood there," he said, "and you let him define you to a room that was ready to believe him. And there was no accusation in it, only acknowledgement, only truth." Emily met his gaze, steady, unflinching, and for the first time that night, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, not for the room, not for anyone watching, but for herself, for the quiet strength that had carried her to this exact moment. And as the silence deepened, stretching into something almost sacred, Alexander's next movement began, small, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. While across from them, Jason finally understood that whatever came next would not just end the scene, it would erase his place in it entirely. He lowered himself to one knee with a calm that did not ask for attention, yet commanded all of it, the movement precise, unhurried, as if this moment had never been in question, and the faint sound of fabric against marble echoed softly in the silence that followed. A collective breath caught across the room, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable, as every eye fixed on the single point where power, intention, and truth had converged. And Emily stood there, completely still, her heartbeat steady now, not racing, not uncertain, but aligned with something deeper, something that felt less like surprise and more like recognition. Alexander reached into his pocket and revealed a small velvet box, its surface catching the warm chandelier light in a quiet shimmer. And even before he opened it, the weight of what it represented settled into the room, into her, into the space between them that no longer belonged to the past. He looked up at her, not searching, not questioning, but certain, his voice carrying just enough to be heard without breaking the intimacy of the moment. "You were told what you are worth," he said, each word measured, deliberate. But worth is not something someone else assigns. It is something revealed when the right person finally sees you. And there was no performance in it, no need to convince, because the truth of it did not rely on volume, only on presence. The box opened, the diamond inside catching the light in a sharp, undeniable brilliance that reflected across the polished surfaces of the room, drawing a soft murmur from the crowd, but it faded quickly, because what mattered was not the ring, not the display, but the quiet gravity of the choice being offered. Across from them, Jason stood motionless, the last fragments of his confidence dissolving into something far more fragile, his expression no longer controlled but exposed. As realization settled fully into place, the understanding that this was not a moment he could interrupt, not a narrative he could rewrite, but an ending he had no part in shaping. Emily's gaze did not leave Alexander's, her breath steady, her shoulders relaxed, and for a brief second, the world narrowed to just this. The echo of his words, the clarity of his intent, and the quiet voice inside her that had once been buried beneath doubt, now rising without hesitation. She thought of the nights she had questioned her own value, the mornings she had rebuilt herself piece by piece, the long, silent work of becoming someone who no longer needed validation to exist. And standing here now, she realized that this was not about being chosen, it was about being seen, truly, completely, without distortion. Alexander held his position, unwavering, not rushing her, not filling the silence, because he understood that the moment did not need urgency, it needed truth, and the room waited, not impatiently, not expectantly, but with a quiet awareness that something irreversible was unfolding. Emily finally moved, a small motion, her hand lifting slightly, not yet reaching, but no longer still, her voice soft when it came, yet clear enough to carry through the silence. "You do not know everything about me," she said, not as a warning, not as hesitation, but as honesty, as the final piece of herself offered without fear. And Alexander's expression softened just enough to answer without words before he spoke. "I know enough to stand here," he replied, and in that simple exchange, something settled, something aligned, as if the question that had once defined her had finally been answered without needing to be asked again. The silence deepened once more, but this time it was not heavy, not uncertain, it was full, complete, and across the room, Jason felt it too, the undeniable shift, the quiet truth that whatever he had tried to diminish had not only endured, but risen beyond anything he could reach. And as Emily's fingers finally moved closer, the moment held, suspended on the edge of decision, where everything that had come before no longer had the power to decide what came next. Her fingers did not rush forward, did not grasp at the moment as if afraid it might disappear. Instead, they moved with quiet certainty, closing the final inch of distance as though she had already crossed it long before tonight. And when her hand finally rested in his, it felt less like a decision and more like a recognition of something that had been building, unseen, undeniable. A soft murmur rippled through the room again, but it carried a different tone now, not curiosity, not gossip, but acknowledgement, as if everyone present understood they were no longer witnessing a spectacle, but the quiet rewriting of a story they had already judged too quickly. Emily's voice, when it came, was steady, almost gentle, yet it carried further than anything spoken that evening. "I am not the woman he left," she said, not looking away, not lowering her gaze. "And I am not the woman he described." And there was no need to raise it, no need to emphasize, because the truth of it settled into the silence with more force than any argument could have. Alexander held her hand with the same calm presence he had carried from the moment he entered, and with a small, deliberate motion, he slid the ring onto her finger, the diamond catching the light once more, but this time it did not command attention. It simply reflected it, a quiet symbol of something already decided. Across the room, Jason's expression tightened, the last thread of control slipping completely as he watched the moment unfold without him, his voice rising again, sharper now, less composed. "This is ridiculous," he said, though it sounded less like a declaration and more like an attempt to anchor himself to something that no longer held. "You think this proves anything?" And the question hung there, hollow, because even as he said it, the answer was already evident in the way the room no longer turned toward him, in the way no one rushed to agree, in the way his voice no longer shaped the space. Emily turned to him then, not fully, not giving him the center again, but enough to acknowledge that he had spoken, and there was no anger in her expression, no need to retaliate. Only a quiet finality that felt almost distant. "It does not need to prove anything," she replied, her tone even, unshaken, "because it is not about you." And the simplicity of it landed harder than any accusation, stripping the moment of the conflict he was trying to create and leaving him with nothing to push against. Alexander rose smoothly to his feet, his hand still holding hers, not possessive, not claiming, but steady, present. And as he stood beside her rather than in front of her, the shift became complete, not a rescue, not a replacement, but a partnership that did not diminish her, did not redefine her, but stood with her exactly as she was. The music, hesitant at first, began to return in the background, soft notes filling the space as the room slowly exhaled, people adjusting, recalibrating, as if reality itself had resumed after a brief but significant interruption. Yet nothing was quite the same, because something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone by conversation or explanation. Emily glanced down, briefly at the ring, the light catching its surface in quiet flashes, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel it, not the weight of expectation, not the pressure of the room, but the simple, undeniable truth that she had not been diminished, not by him, not by the past, not by the version of herself that once believed she needed to be chosen to have value. And as she lifted her gaze again, standing beside Alexander, the room no longer felt like a place she had to endure, but a space she could walk through on her own terms, leaving behind not just a man who had tried to define her, but the entire version of herself that had once believed him.